Okay, at the end of the day, on February 20, 1864, Confederates held the field. The Federal troops were well on their way in flight back towards Jacksonville, never to return to this area again in combat. Of course, they occupied this area for several years in what is known as the Reconstruction period, essentially an armed occupation of one enemy into another enemy's territory. Nothing more fancy than that, which is classic, and it could have been a lot worse than it was. So, in front of the memorial to the Federal troops who died here, 2 years plus after the battle, because this was such a backwater, distant area, the federal government, the federal army, the feds sent a detachment down to recover their dead. When the battle ended, this was Confederate territory. The Confederates took all their dead and buried them. If you died in the Civil War, your government did not ship you anywhere. They buried you right near, either right on the field or near the field or in some convenient location. In many, many, many instances, they created cemeteries out of just regular fields. There wasn't a cemetery there before until they started putting people in the ground there, and then they would use, if they knew who they were, they would use in most cases wooden markers and write on a boom, this is who is here. And if someone's relative many years later or however long later would travel to that location, find that board and place a marker on it, and many years after that, probably 40 or 50 more years after that, the government started taking over the responsibility for doing that, Confederate and Federal, so that you see, there's a few of them here. There's a classic standard, what you would see in a national cemetery. If you've ever been to a national cemetery or seen one of our videos, throw a self-plug there. On the national cemeteries, you'll see rows and rows and rows. St. Augustine's a good example. Arlington's a good example. The Florida National Cemetery is one of the best examples of that I've ever seen, because there's nothing else there. There's just those kind of stones, boom, with names etched on them. So they would have taken those, the Confederates would have taken those bodies somewhere nearby, buried them, marked them, and then the families would have either came, and if they were rich, they would have came and retrieved those families, taken them back to South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, wherever it might have been, and buried them in their family plots or in their local cemeteries in their family plots, but buried them close to their homes. If you didn't have a lot of money, you just came down or wherever it was you went to, and you just erected a marker, or you kept the old wooden marker new, something of that nature. You recognized it, and that's only if you were known. If your body was so badly mangled and people didn't even know who you were, basically, they barely even knew your name, then you would wind up in the Lake City Oaklawn Cemetery under the 155 unknown Confederate dead. That's almost what happened here. 2 years and some after the fact, the Feds sent a detachment down here to locate, identify, and inter the remains of the Federal soldiers who were still on this field. 2 years and some after the battle, there were still guys out here. Now, we know what that looks like today. It must have been 10 times worse back then. It would have been all kinds of just indescribable. For purposes of this video, I won't go into it. But there would have been skeletal remains only. There might have been some buttons, some pieces of fabric, some equipment. But what the guy who was in charge of the detachment said about this area was that he assumed that everybody that he found were Federals, the remains of Federals, because the Confederates had already taken their their dead and buried them. And I won't even go into what that says about Confederate people who left other bodies on the ground and didn't take them. I'll assume that they knew and they just chose not to. But I will say that is unusual. Typically, each side cared for the other and for the remains of the other. So for it's possibly excusable. It's possible that they just said, "Screw you, you guys lay there, stay there." But this is the mass grave right here. There was a cross placed here in 1866 on this site. It deteriorated. It was wood. It was meant to mark the grave of these guys. And these guys were the guys not known either, because they were not identifiable. They didn't have name tags. You didn't have plastic laminated ID or any of that sort of thing. You were known because your buddy knew you, or you stripped your name. You taped your name somewhere. You wrote your name. You taped it inside your jacket or something of that nature. And if you were an officer, of course, everybody knew who you were. But if you were just a regular Joe, there's a good possibility that only a few people would know who you were and everybody else wouldn't. But again, by the time 2 years had passed in the Florida sun and the Florida wilderness, which is what this was back in the day, it's still pretty rural, you would have had, it would have been unidentified. It would have just been skeletal remains. And if DNA would have existed back then, they may have been able to figure it out, but it wasn't happening. So this was erected in, I don't know when it was. I don't see what it says, but it was put here to replace the one that deteriorated. Oh, here we go. 1991. Erected by Union Army District of Florida, May 1991. So some reenactors or some pseudo version of the UDC came down and replaced their monument. So that's it. The rest of the cemetery is much newer. There's some World War II guys here, some World War I guys here. I don't see any Civil War guys here. I don't see anything very old, quote unquote, at all. The guy who did the officer who led the detachment that buried the Union dead here in a mass grave said that the Confederates had a very nice cemetery on the south side of the tracks. Well, that's the south side of the tracks. And I just found out about this when I came up here, so I haven't really had a lot of time to research it. There are some cemeteries around Quitman, South Prong, North Prong. North Prong is up that way, so it can't be that. South Prong and Quitman are both south, but I don't know how many dead that they contain as far as Confederate dead, so I haven't really done a lot of research on that. It kind of took me off guard and I haven't been able to find out very much on my phone. But that's that. I wanted to show this ground as being right on the battlefield. Boom. So they would have found these guys scattered throughout the area back here and over here and over here and over there, brought them to this place, dug a huge hole, buried their skeletons. And as we saw in the Lake City Cemetery, very sad end to people who served their country and passed without anyone knowing who they are. Although it must be said in conjunction with that these were invaders. It wasn't like the people who were defending their homes and somebody came in and basically a home invasion or something. These guys came from 2,000 miles away to impose their will and their government's will on people who only wanted to be left alone. So, and again, this is newer. I can't find a name for this. I didn't know this was here. I've been here before. I don't recall seeing this. I'm sure it was here. Obviously, it's been here for a very long time. Certainly before I was born. But I didn't see it when I came here. I came here twice in the mid-90s. So I didn't see it. I realized it was here. I'm just going to take a quick view around. This one's safe. This is dedicated to this is a Confederate or a Union Federal Memorial. So you can see how nice it is too. Even today, the federal representatives have so much more fun, so much more money. Okay, so we're going to shut this down and head on out.